Out of the east, the patriarch Abraham came to settle in the land of Canaan. Abraham had 2 sons. Ishmael, the elder of the 2, born to the concubine Hagar, was banished to the desert. Abraham's wife, Sarah, gave birth to his 2nd son, Isaac, who was taken to Mount Moriah to be a sacrifice to his God on a stone altar which now stands beneath this golden dome. Millennia passed, and the sons of Abraham were destined to meet again, not in brotherhood, but in bitter struggle, enmity, and war over this, the Promised Land. Once a year, throughout the nation of Israel, everything comes to a halt. On the eve of Independence Day celebrations, this young country silently honors the fallen of 6 wars. Looking at the beauty of this historic city that traces its roots back to the very dawn of Western civilization, it is almost impossible to see how harm or hatred could ever be produced from within its walls. But these are just echoes of the old world, ghosts of generations that said Jews and Arabs must be enemies, for they have always been so. Perhaps then it is no coincidence that the concept of a lasting peace with the most vicious yet most vulnerable enemy of all, the Palestinians, was conceived.
There is no another partner to deliver the Palestinians. With the extreme Islamic groups, it means continuation of violence and terror alone without the hope through negotiation to find a solution. If there is any chance, and I'm not saying it is in the pocket for sure, if there is any chance, is with the PLO of Arafat.
I am coming here carrying in one hand the olive branch, and in the other hand the gun to protect the olive branch.
And after 2,000 years of exile and dispersion and suffering and loneliness and smallness, these Jewish people came back.
Many returned as survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, seeking refuge from a world that watched Hitler annihilate over 6 million European Jews. Seeking a new life in a promised homeland, they are stopped by a British blockade that keeps them out of Palestine by force. Inside the country, British soldiers fail to maintain peace between over 500,000 Jews and 1 million Arabs, each passionately pursuing their own dream of independence. With most Arabs violently opposed to even the concept of a Jewish state, tempers hover around boiling point. As transport and isolated settlements come under increasing Arab attack, life for the Jews of Palestine becomes impossible. In a belated attempt to avert the inevitable confrontation, the United Nations votes to end the British mandate.
Australia? Yes.
On November
Israel?
29, 1947,
Yes.
Palestine was
No,
partitioned into 2 separate
Yes.
states,
Egypt?
one Jewish, one
No.
Arab. The following day in Jerusalem, 5,000 Arabs march out, burning and looting their way towards the Jewish commercial center. A bomb on West Jerusalem's busy Ben Yehuda Street leaves Jewish dead buried beneath the rubble. Arab snipers make daily life ever more precarious. Setting out from the coastal plain, convoys of supplies make desperate attempts to run the gauntlet of continued Arab attacks. Jerusalem finds itself cut off.
In April 48, I appointed a brigade commander of the Harel, the Table Mount Brigade, They had to continue to fight along the road to Jerusalem, to clear the road and to prevent a siege on Jerusalem.
In a determined effort to preserve the dwindling reserves of water and food, rationing is now introduced among Jerusalem's 80,000 Jews.
On the 20th of April, we got an order to move to Jerusalem. Therefore, it was attached to bring about a convoy of 300 trucks that had to supply Jerusalem, and I was ordered to try to conquer and to liberate the whole Jerusalem. It was a very bitter fight.
After heavy fighting, 1,500 Jewish soldiers managed to open the road and take control of strategic parts of Jerusalem. The British, busy with their own preparations for departure, are surprisingly quick to respond, issuing an ultimatum for the Jews to withdraw from their hard-won positions. This was to be one of the final acts of the British in Palestine. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaims the independence of the new Jewish state in the land of Israel. While the last British troops sail out of Haifa Bay, the new Israeli flag is raised over a port now guarded by the first boat in Israel's fledgling navy. But countrywide celebrations were short-lived. The Arab countries decided to attack. Within hours, Egyptian warplanes hovered over the skies of Tel Aviv, releasing their destructive cargo. The Lebanese set their sights on Haifa and Nazareth. Syrian tanks advance on the fertile farmlands around the Sea of Galilee. The Iraqis take up positions in Samaria, hoping to cut Israel in two. Jordan's Arab Legion surrounds Jerusalem. And 10,000 Egyptians cross out of the Sinai Desert to threaten Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. With the whole country a potential battleground, the citizens of Israel soberly joined up. The realities of giving birth to a new country in this volatile region will have dramatic impact on their way of life. Historic consequences which no one could foresee. A small arms industry is started, turning irrigation pipes into primitive mortars and homemade grenades, as the Jews impatiently await the arrival of weapons purchased abroad. Impatient, too, of conscripts swelling the ranks of the Arab Liberation Army. They come to join Iraqi General Fauzi el-Kaukji, who set up positions overlooking the Jezreel Valley, the legendary battlefield of Armageddon. The kibbutz settlements await imminent attack. In northern Israel, each settlement battles for its very existence. They have no choice but to repel the invading armies of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. In the south of Israel, the Egyptian threat is even more ominous. Here, handfuls of barely armed defenders drive back wave after wave of attacks. Standing up to 5 days of Egyptian tank, artillery, and air bombardment, the defenders of kibbutz Yad Mordechai are finally forced to evacuate under cover of darkness. The Egyptians advance within 17 miles of Tel Aviv. After 2 weeks of bitter fighting, the turning point of the war comes when the first 4 aircraft arrive in Israel from Czechoslovakia. With no time for test flights, the first Israeli airmen take off to attack the Egyptian column. Although militarily ineffective, the surprise appearance of the planes sends fear into the Egyptian ranks. Israel then circles the Egyptian flank and mounts the first night counterattack offensive. This throws the Egyptians into total disarray, and all plans for further advance are dropped. Despite this major victory, Israel's situation remained critical. Focus of the battle for Jerusalem was the police station of Latrun, a strategic stronghold overlooking the biblical battlefield of the Ayalon Valley. This fortress-like building, dominating the western entrance to Jerusalem, was securely in the hands of the Arab Legion. The Legion had orders from Transjordan's King Abdallah to occupy every inch of Arab Palestine, but his main ambition lay with the holy city of Jerusalem. Waves of badly planned and executed operations saw casualties mount daily for the Israelis. Their failure to dislodge the Legion from Latrun led to the ever-tightening stranglehold the Arabs held on Jerusalem. When word came of the fall of the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem's old city, morale hit rock bottom. After 2 weeks of the war's most savage fighting, the Jewish quarter surrendered. Over 1,000 ultra-Orthodox Jewish civilians, plus the few remaining fighters that had defended them, followed their rabbis out of the old city. With the city at the end of its limited supplies, the Israelis at last completed a road across the mountains and brought the first convoy in months to Jerusalem. The siege of the city was finally lifted. Over the months that followed, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, was forged in fire to emerge as the well-equipped and organized fighting force that stamped its hallmark on Middle East affairs for almost the next half-century. Israel cleared the Galilee and the center of the country. Egyptian forces in the south were routed from the Negev and driven back into the Sinai Peninsula, while King Abdallah annexed the West Bank into his renamed Kingdom of Jordan. But Jerusalem remained a divided city, connected to the rest of Israel only by a slender umbilical cord. The fighting was over and armistice agreements were signed. Demarcation lines drawn on the map would be determined by future wars. The fighting left some 800,000 Palestinian Arabs homeless. They became the victims of a continuous struggle between Arab leaders' ambitions and Jewish survival in the region. These refugees were destined to become a core issue in the long-simmering Middle East conflict. Since its creation, the State of Israel has fulfilled a promise to be a safe haven for Jews around the world. In 1949, a tidal wave of refugees was speeding its way toward the shores of the new state. Tens of thousands arrive every month from the devastation of Europe or driven from their homes in Arab lands. Almost all come penniless to the Promised Land. The immigrants are housed in tent cities and makeshift camps spread throughout the country. Slowly, the country succeeds in building more permanent homes for the immigrants. New settlements spring up all over the country, some planned as urban centers, most as agricultural communities. Almost all are within walking distance of a border. It is across these borders that Arab Fedayeen guerrillas maintain a relentless stream of attacks on civilian targets. The Israeli army mounts continuous action against the constant Fedayeen incursions. Retaliatory raids often take the IDF deep into Arab territory, striking at Fedayeen bases in Jordan and Egypt. In Egypt, at the same time, great social upheaval is underway. On a wave of popular support, Gamal Abdel Nasser leads a bloodless coup. King Farouk is swept into exile. Egypt becomes a republic, with Nasser promising widespread reform. Aiming for leadership of the whole Arab world, Nasser is quick to raise the battle cry against Israel. Negotiating a massive Soviet-backed arms deal with Czechoslovakia, Egypt gains a 4-to-1 weapons supremacy over Israel. Establishing a joint military command with Syria and with young King Hussein of Jordan, Nasser confidently begins to move. His aim, the destruction of both the Jewish state and Western influence in the Middle East. Closing the Straits of Tiran with long-range guns at Bab el-Mandeb, Nasser cuts off Israel's sea link to Africa and the Far East. The city of Suez at the entrance to the canal that connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Expelling British and French troops from their bases in the Suez Canal zone, Nasser promptly nationalizes this strategic waterway. When he pours weapons into the Sinai Peninsula, war becomes inevitable. The French approach Shimon Peres, then Director General of the Defense Ministry, to present Israel with a secret plan. The French would supply Israel with badly needed weapons, and Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, threatening the Suez Canal. This would give the Allies an excuse to intervene and invade the canal zone.
With my connections in France, the French invited me and says, look, we plan to have an operation which will be called Musketeer. It will be us and the British, but you have reasons of your own to participate. If you want to, we can coordinate either the time or the war.
On October 29, 1956, Israeli planes fly low over Sinai, cutting telephone wires. Transport planes carry men and equipment that parachute into the Mitla Pass. Advancing to the eastern entrance of the mountain pass, the Israelis are pinned down by an Egyptian air attack. The following 7-hour battle sees 38 more Israeli paratroopers and over 200 Egyptian soldiers killed. The rest of the Egyptians retreat from the Mitla, escaping back towards the canal. With the Mitla Pass secured, Israeli armor rolls forward into the peninsula, along lines of movement dictated throughout history by the rigors of the terrain. Picking up momentum across the desert sands, Israel's armored corps proves the most effective fighting force in its own right. Previously thought of as support for the main infantry forces, this discovery was to shape future Israeli military thinking. So was the need of good air cover. French-built Mystère and Vautour jet fighters attack Egyptian troops, artillery and armor. Israel finds itself in hot pursuit of the tail of the fast-retreating Egyptians. Roads were littered with abandoned equipment and thousands of Egyptian soldiers who quit their positions to make their way on foot across the sand dunes of the desert. In 100 hours of battle, Israel captured the entire Sinai Peninsula, taking the Suez Canal, cleared the Gaza Strip of Fedayeen guerrillas, and finally destroyed the Egyptian gun batteries at Bab el-Mandeb, reopening the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping.
The 56th War was part of a major operation that was planned by Britain and France against the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser. We played a minor role in this operation.
On November 1st, as the Allies landed in the canal zone, Suez became an international crisis. Too reminiscent of gunboat diplomacy and too close to nuclear confrontation, America and the USSR demand a unilateral withdrawal. Britain and France quickly buckle to international pressure and withdraw. Reluctantly, and only after UN soldiers are placed in Sinai, do Israeli troops pull out. In Israel, opposition leader Menachem Begin incites massive demonstrations, calling the withdrawal a dishonor to the fighters. As for Nasser, he became the hero who held off the combined might of Western imperialism and the Zionist enemy. One of Israel's few tangible gains from the Sinai War was a flourishing relationship with France. As well as a continued flow of conventional weapons, French assistance helped build Israel's secret nuclear reactor.
At that time, to build a nuclear reactor was quite a sensational story. Nobody believed that a small country like Israel can do it. I wasn't impressed by that, but we can do it then, and we did it. And it came out that this created also sort of a deterrent around Israel. It was really foggy, ambiguous. And on many occasions, many people ask, why don't you get rid of the ambiguity and be clear? And our answer is very simple. If ambiguity can create a deterrence, why get rid of it? Why should we tell our neighbors, look, don't you worry, we have nothing. We have never said that we have something.
Over the next decade, the border with Egypt remains relatively quiet. In Jerusalem, Israeli and Arab Legion soldiers face off across a divided city. High walls separate the two sides, but just meters from the border, life goes on as normal. Children of immigrants play together on one side, while across the street, around the Damascus Gate, it's business as usual. The Golan Heights, great natural ramparts, fortified with Syrian gun emplacements, dominate the Sea of Galilee and the lush, fertile fields of the Hula Valley. Undefined since 1948, the border is determined by the plow. Under a constant threat of landmines from below or being fired on from above, farmers work with permanent army protection. The masses call for jihad, holy war against the Zionists, while Egyptian television sends a clear message to Israel. The Arab nation has decided that the land of Palestine will be purified from your presence. Therefore, pack your belongings and escape now before death finds you. Egypt demands a UN withdrawal from Sinai and Gaza. The whole country waits for war. Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin supervises the preparation of one of the most daring battle plans ever conceived. On the morning of June 5th, 1967, the Israeli Air Force takes to the skies in a desperate all-or-nothing bid to break the fighting power of Egypt. With split-second timing, Israeli jets arrive simultaneously over 11 Egyptian airstrips, just as the Egyptian pilots below were having their morning coffee. Without reducing speed, in one pass after another, they devastate the aircraft laid out neatly on the tarmacs below them. It now remained for the ground forces to finish what the Air Force had begun. And so they did. In 4 days of almost uninterrupted fighting, with fierce tank-to-tank battles raging across the desert, Israeli armor and infantry breaks the back of 7 Egyptian divisions.
We developed advanced gunnery system that brought about tremendous improvement in the accuracy of our gunners. We then really knocked out tanks in 2-kilometer range, which was quite unusual for all the tank forces all over the world.
Capturing the whole of the Sinai Peninsula in less than 100 hours, thousands of Egyptian prisoners fall into Israeli hands. The war with Jordan begins when King Hussein orders his artillery to open fire on Jewish West Jerusalem and along the borders. Told by Nasser that Egypt is scoring spectacular successes, Hussein rushes to join the ranks of the victors. It proves to be a fatal mistake. Israel's reply is a swift 3-day campaign that sweeps the Jordanians from the West Bank and pushes the border back to the Jordan River. Not stopping there, Israeli armored columns press north, straight into action to dislodge the Syrians from the Golan Heights. Under pressure to complete the operation before a ceasefire comes into effect, Israeli armor attacks. In a maneuver they had been specially training for in secret, Israeli tanks cut a road straight up the Golan's steepest slope, exactly at the point where the Syrian defenses are weakest. With a great loss of life in hand-to-hand fighting, the infantry overcomes a near impregnable fortress. When it falls, the Syrian army crumbles. Many Syrians fall prisoner, and finally, Israel occupies the Golan Heights. But without doubt, the central and most symbolic battle of the war came on the 3rd day, in Jerusalem. After 30 hours of continuous and bloody fighting, in which they lost over 1 in 5 of their men, a reserve brigade of Israeli paratroopers managed to break in through the walls of the old city, here at the Lion's Gate. In house-to-house fighting along every inch of its narrow lanes, with Arab Legion snipers covering them from every possible angle, the troops edged their way towards the Temple Mount. At last, the Western Wall, holiest site of Judaism, is back in Jewish hands. Within days of the city being united, the dividing walls are dismantled. Jews and Arabs mingle on the streets, fascinated to meet one another face to face. The 6-day war is over. The victory is total, or so it seems. A bomb rips open the Machane Yehuda market in Jerusalem, killing dozens and wounding many more. The car bomb, parked outside a barber shop, was timed to explode on Friday afternoon when the market was full of shoppers. The attack, launched by PLO terrorists based in Lebanon, is a reminder to Israel that it has 1 million Palestinians under occupation. The 6-day war, where this had been a swift and decisive war, the next, the war of attrition, will prove a long, drawn-out and painful campaign. Trained for mobile and fluid military action, Israel's army reluctantly digs in to a line of defensive bunkers along the Suez Canal. Snipers from observation towers keep the Israelis pinned down in their trenches, unable to raise their heads. The tension remains high. When President Nasser dies, to be replaced by Anwar Sadat, the southern border goes into a state of flux. The lands gained during a six-day war quickly become popular tourist sites, and later, new settlement areas for the Israeli people. Oil, discovered under the sands of Sinai, plus cheap labor from Gaza and the West Bank, help create a boom for Israel's expanding economy. As affluence spreads amongst the people, it gives rise to the one thing Israel can ill afford: complacency. The Day of Atonement, 1973, the holiest day of the Jewish year. Nobody drives, no radios play. Believers give up the day to prayer and fasting. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the combined power of 3,000 artillery pieces opens fire. The invasion of the Sinai and the Golan Heights begins with a vengeance.